Thank you for joining us as we continue our celebration of Women's History Month with a very special guest, the #1 New York Times bestselling author, Kristen Hanna. I'm your host, Alan Cardoza. Now, Kristen is the award-winning and best-selling author of more than 20 novels, including the international blockbuster The Nightingale, which was named Goodreads' Best Historical Fiction Novel for 2015 and won the coveted People's Choice Award for the Best Fiction in the same year. In 2018, The Great Alone became an instant #1 New York Times bestseller and was named the Best Historical Novel of the Year by Goodreads. Four Winds, another one of her books, was published in February of 2021 and immediately hit #1 on the New York Times list. It was also a Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and indie bookstores bestseller list. Additionally, it was selected as a book club. It was picked by the Today Show and the Book of the Month Club, which named it the best book of 2021. Now, The Nightingale is currently in production at TriStar with Dakota and Ella Fanning set to star. TriStar has also optioned The Great Alone, and it is in development. Now, Firefly Lane, her beloved novel, which is about two best friends, was the #1 Netflix series around the world in the first week that it came out. Now, the popular TV show, it stars Katherine Heigl and Sarah Chalk. Hanna now brings us her next epic, The Women, set during the Vietnam War. Hanna, welcome to Answers Network.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you, Alan.
Well, it is my pleasure, and I'm so glad that you could join us at this time. And having had a chance to go through some of your other books, I love the fact that you do period pieces. And some of my favorite novels are ones that touch on history, so that I feel like I'm learning. And in some cases, it can be a history that it's still recent enough that it also brings back memory. And that's what I found with your book that now touches on the Vietnam era. So what propelled you to write that particular era? Because for those of us that were around then, there was a lot of controversy going on at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've actually wanted to write this book for 20 years. I first pitched it to an editor in 1997. And not this book exactly, but a Vietnam era book. And my editor very wisely said, you aren't really old enough and you aren't really ready. And frankly, nobody wants to read about Vietnam anyway. So why don't you, put this on the back burner and think about it for a while, which is what I did. And I think the reason that this book and this era was so important to me was I was a child during the Vietnam War, elementary school and junior high. And it cast a huge shadow across, my childhood. My best friend at the time, her father was an Air Force pilot who served in Vietnam and was shot down. And at that time, we wore these silver prisoner of war bracelets. So I got my first one, I think got his when I was 11. And it had his name and the date that he was shot down on it. And the idea was that you would wear these bracelets in remembrance of the servicemen until he came home. Right. And so I wore this bracelet for decades. He never came home. And so his story and his name was sort of always in my consciousness as I was growing up. And then later on, of course, I saw how the Vietnam vets were treated when they came home. And because a lot of them were my friends' fathers, that really impacted me deeply. And so I kept wanting to write about this era. And every couple of years, I'd think, is this the time? Am I ready to do this? And I kept thinking, no, not yet. No, not yet. And then in March of 2020, I live in Seattle, and we were on lockdown, of course. And I was watching the news, as we all were, all the time. And I was seeing the division, the chaos, the anger, I was seeing things happening in America that felt very much like the Vietnam era again. And I was also seeing our doctors and our nurses who were on the front line of this pandemic sacrificing so much for us. And often I thought not getting the support and the recognition and the gratitude that they deserved. And somehow at that moment, it all came together to me. And I thought, I'm going to write about, the forgotten nurses who served in Vietnam. And I thought it was time for this subject to sort of be back in conversation again.
Well, I couldn't agree more with everything that you just said. And as you were describing that, one of the things that it was reminding me is in about that same time, a lot of what I was doing was working with at-risk youth. And I started to see this continuing dialogue of doom and gloom, that we're never going to get through this. It's only getting worse, with the divisiveness, with the just everything that was going on. And as strange as this sounds, I told some of them when I realized that it was on, I think, Amazon Prime, and I said, I want you to watch a TV show called Laugh In. And they said, what? And I said, I'm serious. I said, because what you will see is that during that time, and it started in 1967, for those of us that remember Laugh In, I said, when you watch this, you will see that much of what they're talking about, and they're talking about how divisive it is, and they're talking about issues with war, issues with diversity, with pollution, and so on, that there was a time in which a lot of us were thinking, wow, I don't know how we're going to get through this. So I tried to give them something to where we've gone through this before. Many of you don't realize it, but we can get through it again. And so anyway, it's interesting that we sort of had a similar thing. You saw it was time to bring something out to let them know that we have been through this time before, and shine a light on it. And I think that's great.
I think, Alan, I mean, that's one of course, the benefits of historical fiction is you can, highlight an era, and you don't really have to say anything about it personally or politically. Your job as a novelist is to put people in the shoes of other people and let them empathize and sort of metabolize that era and come to these conclusions on their own. And, I know that when The Four Winds, my previous book, came out about the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, it seemed, light years away from where we were at the time when the book came out. And yet suddenly we were in the middle of a pandemic. Yeah. And it was really important, I think, for people to read about the Great Depression and remember the great courage and resilience of the American people. Exactly. And how we have survived and changed and grown and come back to who we want to be, regardless of how far afield we sometimes go.
And it was one of the things that I recognized in your book. I'm getting feedback. So let me pause for a moment. Anyway, as I was saying, one of the things that I got from your book was that there was no slant to it. It was you were getting information and you were putting it out there for people to feel it, to feel the emotion, and which I think is wonderful, because one of the things that drives me crazy now is with our news and everything else, everything has a slant. It's no longer news, it's views. It's okay, and it's like, okay, you're giving me your view, but that's not the news. That's not exactly how things have happened. So again, one of the things that I really appreciated in your book was, again, I felt there was no slant. It's, we're placing you there. We're letting you feel what it is that's going on at that time.
Yeah, I worked actually really hard at sort of threading threading that needle, because it was, it was a fine path I was trying to follow. But one of the things that the book says, obviously it talks about how important it is for us as a nation to show gratitude and respect for any serviceman who we
Yep.
send, or woman who we send into harm's way. And it is obviously incumbent upon us to care for them fully and completely, when they come home. Obviously, that is hugely important. But it was also really important to me to show that the protest mattered as well, and that that this was a time where people were very quick to sort of
Mhm.
stand up for what they believed in. And even though there were people on both sides of the equation, it's important for us to remember, because we've gotten to this place in America where you're either on my side or you're wrong. And we need to remember that we are so much stronger when we're together, and when we recognize and empathize with and incorporate a larger sort of worldview than that.
Again, I couldn't agree more. And what I hear you saying is that we were kind of at a time, or at least, and I felt that we could disagree, and the concept, we could come back to the concept of freedom of speech, and we could look at it and go, well, I may not agree with that, but you have the freedom to express that. And and I don't feel like it's there now. Now the idea of freedom of speech is you have freedom of speech as long as you agree with me.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing for those of us who have, been around a while. Um, and one of the things that's interesting about the women is my protagonist, Frankie, part of her arc, of course, which represents the generation, is this realization over time that her
Mhm.
government wasn't telling her the truth, and that the media wasn't therefore reporting the truth. And so there's, that's important. And here we are in this time period now where it is really difficult even to just find unslanted news. We've sort of moved into these encampments, and somehow we have to find our way back to this idea that the news is supposed to be objective.
Yeah, yeah, I know. In fact, and it made me think of something. And I have no interest in this particular website that I'm going to mention, but there's a website called All Sides. And what I like about it is that it takes in the news that comes out there, and then it tells you, this particular news agency reports this like this. Understand that they slant left. This particular news agency reports the same thing, and here's what they say, and note that they slant right. And so you actually get to read it in both ways, but you're also being reminded that you can look at two different things and go, okay, now I can have a better chance of figuring out what might be the truth.
Yeah, it is definitely incumbent upon us to become, the best consumer of news that we can
Mhm.
be.
Well, and again, one of the things that I love about your book, and most any book that is researched so well. And again, for those that don't know my real job or whatever, I'm an international detective. So research is my thing. So as I did my research on you, I learned that you're known for your meticulous research. So I was like, this is great. And so especially, as I'm now reading the women, I'm going, well, this is no exception. So my question is, what were a few of the most compelling or startling facts that you learned when researching the Vietnam War, and particularly about the nurses who were there serving our country?
Well, research, of course, I love. I mean, I love doing it, and it's hugely important. And this was the first time I felt that I was writing a historical novel, which, by the way, is during my lifetime, but I'm not going to get into that. This historical novel. Um,
Mhm.
and I knew that there would be a lot of people reading it who had actually experienced the things that I was going to be writing about at a much, deeper level than I had as a child. So it was really important, to be as accurate and as authentic as possible, to sort of be true, to the extent that you can be, because sometimes truth and facts aren't exactly in alignment.
Mhm.
But the thing that surprised me the most in doing the research, and you and I were speaking about this sort of in the green room, I guess,
Mhm.
was the amount of times that I kept reading in the nurses' memoirs and in historical accounts that women, upon coming home, had been told repeatedly, but there were no women in Vietnam. The VA can't help you. There were no women in Vietnam. You can't do a veterans march against the war because, this is men and we want to be taken seriously. And if you're here, we will be treated differently. And so here were these women who, like many of their male counterparts, had been raised in greatest generation homes and sort of, fed into their pride over their family's service in World War II. And these very young women, answered the call of duty as nurses and went to serve their country, and then came home and just were repeatedly told that they hadn't been there, and found their history erased. And in addition to that, PTSD was not something that was being well treated for male
Right.
veterans, and there was certainly no help for women. And so that was probably the most amazing thing, because you can't imagine how people didn't know that women were there. Women were there in World War II. They were there in Korea. They were there in World War I. They were there earlier. We were watching MASH. So it was very clear that women were there. And so the extent to which their service was forgotten or erased, depending on how you looked at it, was
Right.
absolutely stunning to me.
Well, stop me if I'm in any of my questions, if I'm giving away too much too
Okay.
much information on the book. So feel free to stop me at any time. But you mentioned Frankie, and Frankie, for those that haven't read the book, is the Vietnam nurse and star of this book. Um, she saved hundreds of soldiers' lives. But you mentioned that, I mean, through her parents, and particularly her father, they couldn't see her as a war hero. Now, did you find that this lack of acceptance, or her heroism, was indicative of how many parents of that time viewed their daughters? And if so, why?
You know what? I think, Alan, it's entirely possible that this particular issue extended to male veterans to some extent as well, because you're talking about a time period where, we talked about the tumultuousness of the era and the
Right.
political division. And what was happening, in fact, when these vets came home in their uniforms, they were spit upon, they were flipped off, taxi
Yep.
cabs wouldn't
I
pick
know.
them up. Nobody wanted to talk about as the tide turned against the war. Nobody wanted to sort of separate the soldier from the war. But with women, I think it was even a further layer of invisibility. And I think for many, many female vets coming home, their families were actively ashamed that they had,
Mm.
gone over to serve. I did a signing, where was I forget. I think I was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania recently, and a woman stood up and she was crying at the microphone,
Mm.
and she said, "I've been waiting for this book for 50 years.
Wow.
When I volunteered as a nurse to go to Vietnam, my father got so angry at me for doing this, and he said, essentially, good women don't go off to war," and didn't speak to me again for years. And so I know that these kinds of reactions, existed.
Well, if I can, I'll go on a little bit of a soapbox. As you were saying that, I think part of the frustration that I'm feeling is, and maybe the similarity to what's going on now, is, um, those people were then, or whatever war they've been at, are out there um, giving everything for us, for our freedom, and for people to be upset with them, as you said, spit on them, things like that. That is not who you need to vent your displeasure with. Do it towards the politicians that sent them there. That's who you need to go
Exactly.
over. Yes.
And I had one woman come up and she said, I am from a Gold Star Vietnam family. And I want you to
Mm,
know that we have grieved in shame and silence for 45 years or whatever. And I do think, as much as I often think as a historical fiction novelist, that we don't learn, because
mhm.
things keep happening over and over again. I do believe that with respect to this issue and veterans, I believe we collectively as Americans recognized our mistake. And I think it was our shame and guilt which turned this into a taboo subject. And I truly don't believe, I hope to gosh, that we would not ever make this mistake again.
Wow. We are talking to Kristen Hanna. Her book is called The Women, and it is written based on the real life nurses that served in the Vietnam War. Is it true that the inspiration of the character Frankie comes from a real life nurse who did serve in Vietnam? And if so, what did you learn from her that maybe didn't make it into the book about what really went on at that time?
I wouldn't say that she was inspired by, because actually Frankie is kind of like a wholly imagined character who is based on many memoirs, and sort of
Okay.
I take all of the information and all the research and put it through, the sieve of my mind, and come up with someone who is different than what I have read about. But I did, when I finished the first draft of this, I realized that I was going to need some serious vetting. Because, like I said, I wrote this during the pandemic. So there was no interviewing people, there was no going to places, there was no visiting. So I really needed help. And I found this woman, Diane Carlson Evans, who was a former Army nurse, and she had written a memoir called Healing Wounds, which is a
Mm.
remarkable book. I loved it. And so I really kind of, stalked her on the internet until I found her and got her to read and really help me and mentor me. She's turned into quite a friend, and she was a profound inspiration. And she led me to others. There was a nurse named Beth Parks. There was a helicopter medevac pilot, Doug Moore. So she kind of had other people help me along the way. And I would say that, the thing that was most interesting in terms of the truth and their experiences, I mean, a lot of their personal experiences just were too over the top even for me to use. I mean, there were, stories that they told me and I thought nobody's going to believe that. And, it was just sort of the both the horrors of war and the camaraderie. I mean, I think
Yeah.
the real beating heart of the women is friendship. It's about these three women who become friends. They're hooch mates in Vietnam, and they become friends for the rest of, their life. And I think that, we're all very used to seeing male war camaraderie play out. And so I really enjoyed being able to show, to show that from a female perspective, how living through times like this that are so intense and so frightening really forge indomitable friendships.
I got to tell you, I'm just so touched. And again, for anybody out there, having had the opportunity to read through the book, and there's so many touching moments. And as you brought up when you mentioned about camaraderie, um, there are moments in which you feel what it is that they're going through, and yet the camaraderie seems to get them through. And that's one of the things that I found to be just so amazing, while reading it. And again, it's one of those things that at times you feel like you're being entertained. At times it's emotionally draining as you're taking this in. But Hannah, let me ask you. So, as you're writing this, so I mean, besides being, you're entertaining people, you're also touching a very deeply emotional subject. If you had to kind of narrow it down, what do you hope that the majority of the readers will learn about this era of our history through your book, The Women?
I've thought about that a lot, actually. And to go back a little bit to answer that, last November, Diane Evans was gracious enough to invite me to join her in Washington, D.C. for Veterans Day. It was the 30th anniversary of the Women's Vietnam Memorial, which she is the founder of, and she was speaking at the wall. And so this was really the first time, post COVID, I went out and I saw these nurses gather at their own memorial. And they do a thing called storytelling, where they come up to a podium and tell whatever story they have to tell about their service. And it could be the children, it could be the husband, it could be the service woman herself. And what struck me so completely was they kept talking over and over again about having been forgotten, about those in their midst who they had lost, whether to Agent Orange or cancer or whatever it is. And I was just struck with how much it meant to them both to gather together again,
Mm-hmm.
and to see, 100 female vets standing at their own memorial, laughing and crying and talking. It was just heart expanding to see that this is, 50 years later, a lot of them hadn't seen each other since, and yet they were sort of instantly sisters again. And that was really powerful. And then to realize that the point of their storytelling is really the point of the women as well, which is ultimately that remembrance matters. And
Mm-hmm.
I think we're living in a time right now, which I love. And it's one that is highlighting diverse and marginalized and forgotten historical stories. Because we've all, you go through school and you learn a certain view of history, but there's so much more. And I just think it's important, if we want to be the best of who we are, we have to remember the contribution of so many groups that have made our country what it is.
Yeah. Well, the story that you referred to, so for our audience, that we talked about in the green room, and it kind of touches on this concept of these nurses being invisible, being over there serving our country, and yet literally being invisible at that time and even after they come back. And the story I told was I was sitting around a campfire in a very small town in Arizona with my stepdad, and everyone else there was a Vietnam veteran, and they were all sitting around talking about, that they were talking about a variety of things. They were talking about, what took place there, what they're doing now afterwards. But anyways, they were doing different things, and one person says something about being there in a particular year. And one of the guys got angry and he said, well, that's not possible, because at that time there were no women there. There was only Rangers, special forces, and Green Berets. And so, there is no way that, or you said you couldn't possibly have been there because there was no women there. And so he said, well, that's because I wasn't a woman at that time. And everybody, all of these men just froze. They didn't know what to say. but it kind of went to that same point. Now, this person ended up having a sex change operation after that, but he had served as a ranger over there, and the sheer fact that a woman in this conversation actually even brought anger to one of these men. And it was a very strange and unusual thing for me, and I was the youngest person sitting there at the time. But I did think about this as I started going through your book, and that thought of that particular time, and being invisible. That after this person served, that they went through this change, and now they were told they have to be invisible.
One of the things that was really interesting to me that I came across in my research was one of the nurses' responses to "you were not there, there were no women there," was, if you didn't see a woman in Vietnam, you were lucky, because it meant you were not in a hospital.
It's a great
And
point.
so, yeah. Although there were also these women that I met also at Veterans Day, the Red Cross workers, which were called donut dollies. And these were women who, went out alone to sort of buoy the spirits of the men and read letters and write letters. And, there were women who were there who were not just nurses, but nurses were the lion's share.
I love that line. If you never saw a woman, you were lucky.
Right. That's what I thought too.
Yeah. So one of the things that we talked a little bit about was the connection between then and now. So what don't we know, or what might we not remember about that time? And do you think knowing those details now, is it going to be helpful to understand our country's polarized politics today?
I think of that often, because one of the things about that era in retrospect, when the Vietnam War ended and Nixon was out of office, there was sort of an immediate sea change. And there was a way for the country to politically pivot. And I think there was a real sense of, let's get back to who we are and who we intend to be. Because you got to remember, this was an era where the government opened fire on students who were peacefully protesting. So it was a really difficult time, and people wanted to move on from that. And so that is the question. I mean, is there a pivot point here? Is there a tipping point? How do we get back? I mean, one has to believe, if you're an optimist like I am, that there is a course and it will happen. But I don't see, historically, I can't look and say, well, this needs to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, for those who were listening earlier, we talked a little bit about Frankie, and Frankie is sort of the star, the main character of the book. Share with us a little bit about Frankie's character and how it changes throughout the novel, and what are some of the factors that you felt influenced this transformation that you wrote for her?
Well, Frankie is very much a product of the research. She is sort of emblematic of the kind of young woman who went to serve in Vietnam. So she grows up on Coronado Island, which we all know is this beautiful little idyllic island right off of San Diego that is both very affluent and very military. And so she grows up with, both of these factors in her life. Her brother goes off to Vietnam. Her parents are so proud of his service. And yet when she signs up to follow him, they are not so proud. She lands in country at 21, barely 21, with about 2 weeks of practical nursing training, and is immediately over her head and thrown into the deep end of the ocean, and really wonders, what she's doing here, that she can't imagine that she will ever be able to make a contribution, which I think is, like I said, this is how so many of the nurses felt when they landed, and perhaps the male vets as well. But over the course of her tours of duty, of course, she becomes a remarkable combat nurse. And when she comes home, it is to a very, very different America, really, than the one that she left. And so you look at a woman who basically came of age in the late 50s, in this time of conformity, and she comes back after the summer of love, and America is divided, and protests and the Civil War movement, or civil rights going on. And she expects, I think, what every soldier has every right to expect when they come home from serving their country in battle, that she will be welcomed and thanked. And like all vets, she is not, and from this war, and she is suffering from PTSD, which she can get no help from. So there's this line in the book, something like, Frankie realizes that if she is going to be saved, she is going to have to save herself. And that is the arc. How does a person come to terms with all of this grief and loss and anger and shame and guilt when nobody's acknowledging it, and nobody is there to help you except your girlfriends who also went through it?
We have a question that's come in, and this one reads, my mother served as a nurse in the Vietnam War, and she did not talk about it until approximately a year before she passed away. And at that time, it was very, very emotional for her to even speak about it that long after it occurred. My question is, did you speak with any children of those women who served, and how did the children say that they handled it, having come from a mother who served at that time? Oh, and this is from, I'm sorry, this is from Marilyn in Orlando, Florida.
Thank you, Marilyn. Yes, I was really lucky to speak with the daughter of Linda Van Devanter, who wrote a book called Home Before Morning, which is one of the memoirs that I read in my research. And her daughter's name is Molly Stillman. And when she heard about the women coming out, she started posting all over Instagram and Facebook or wherever. I'm not very good on social media, but somehow I saw one of her posts and I reached out to her and, sent her a copy of the women. And, we've ended up talking. She has a book coming out called If I Don't Laugh, I'll Cry, I believe in April. And it is very much about her journey of coming to terms with the way her mother was treated. I mean, she had sort of this bird's eye view because her mother was very much an activist. And so Molly and her family saw right what was going on with their mother and how she was treated and the difficulties that she had. Molly talks about her mother having kind of a flashback, a PTS flashback during a concert where Molly was young and had brought her friends, and how difficult it was to understand all this. And so, yeah, I think books like that, I'm hoping that this book, The Women, will spark other books and other conversations, because most of the children that I am meeting, their vet parents didn't speak about this at all, ever.
Wow. Well, and coming back to you, I learned that you're currently touring around the country in regards and speaking about this book. How have your travels been going so far? And what is the difference between this tour and the tours that you've had for your previous books?
The really huge difference on this book, I saw this a little bit with The Nightingale, which is my book that set in World War II France. But this book in particular, the response that I'm getting from female vets really across the board. So it's not just Vietnam. I think female vets in general feel invisible and forgotten. So I'm hearing a lot from female vets. I'm hearing a lot from the children. Like I said, you know, people talking about how they had to process this grief within their own family when they couldn't talk about it, and coming back to this idea that remembrance is so important. And so I had an event in Costa Mesa, actually, and an Army nurse that I've met named Eileen Moore. Now I think she's a judge in California. She, you know, stood up to the microphone and said, "I've brought 4 of my fellow sister nurse veterans with me."
Wow.
And this 2,000 person crowd gave them a standing ovation, absolutely spontaneously. And that's the kind of thing that I'm seeing that is just really unusual, obviously. So I think this book, it's hitting a nerve. It's coming at a time where we are losing our Vietnam vets. And hopefully it is sparking this conversation that can help heal them in some way. That's what I keep hearing, that this book is helping to heal them.
Well, it sounds like your producer or agent was right when you went to them about 20 years ago and they said it's not the right time. It sounds like it is the right time. Now, again, in doing some of my research, I learned that that this book is being optioned for a film. And that's got to be very exciting. Can you give us some of the details? And if so, how much can you give it?
All I can tell you is at this moment, it's Warner Brothers and it's feature film. And they're
Okay.
very excited about it. I mean, obviously the book is just sparking such a huge and visceral emotional response. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. I'm very excited about it.
Well, we will be keeping our eye out for it. Now, is there anything else that you're working on now that you would like to share? We've only got about another minute, but if there's anything else you would like to share, please let us know what you're working on now and how we can get that information out to people.
You know, I don't actually have anything that I'm working on now. I should be, but I'm not. What I will say is, if you read The Women and you love it, and what I'm hearing is people want more information because this was forgotten on so many levels for so long. I would say that in the back of the book there are a listing of some memoirs and some nonfiction books that I found really, really interesting, and I think give an important insight into parts of this story, and you might try reading some of those.
Excellent. Again, for everybody out there, the book is The Women. The author is Kristen Hanna. Highly recommend that you go out, that you get this. I don't think we need to tell you it's going to be at whatever bookstore you happen to go to. If you have the opportunity to use your local bookstore, feel free to do that. Anything that we can do to help keep our local bookstores in business. And if you contact them, if they say they don't have it, I'll bet they can order it real quick. So anyway, Kristen, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for shining a light on something that for many people has been forgotten.
Thank you, Alan. This was really great talking to you. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.